Hi. Good morning. Okay, so I'm Jason. Well, this is very loud. Okay. I'm Jason Grinblat, and I'm the co-creator of Roguelike called Caves of Qud. And today I'm going to be telling you about procedurally generated histories in Caves of Qud through the stories of 5 ancient leaders that were generated across multiple games of Qud, leaders that we call sultans in the game world. So let me tell you a bit about Caves of Qud first, if you're not familiar with it. So it's an open world roguelike. It's very heavily inspired by Adam, so I'm very happy to follow Thomas. It's also a science fantasy RPG, so the tagline is chiseled through a layer cake of thousand-year-old civilizations. I'm going to be reading a lot, so okay. It's inspired largely by a pen and paper RPG called Gamma World, which was a derivative of Dungeons and Dragons, and it's this sort of pulpy science fiction setting that's set in like a post-apocalyptic future where nuclear radiation has uplifted animals and plants to human-level intelligence. There's a handcrafted narrative of the sort you might expect to find in like a traditional RPG, or like if you think of like an open world Bethesda game, but we've sort of tried to weave it around a bunch of simulative systems. So simulative systems like physical systems, taking a page from Dwarf Fortress, you can dig a tunnel anywhere in the world. You can, like every wall has a melting point. There are social systems. There's a complex network of NPCs and factions that you could interact with and gain reputation with. And then most recently, there's this historical system. So like at the start of every game, we generate a new history, and we sort of use that to seed the world generation, and like those locations from the history end up being instantiated in the world, and they're places that you could explore. So if you could imagine with me, if you will, that you're a lore seeker in a wild and fractured world. You've just arrived on the edge of this strange place called Qud, where poison jungles strangle chrome steeples and rusted archways to the earth. Your first stop is the oasis hamlet of Joppa, which is a small village on the edge of a great salt desert. So you arrive at Joppa, and you notice in the northeast corner, there's this ancient stone vine-swathed shrine. So your curiosity piqued, you make your way there, and you approach the shrine to examine it. So it's a shrine to Osei, the Tellid Magenta Sorrow of Cabanip. The shrine depicts a significant event from the life of the ancient Sultan Osei. After conferring with trees, Osei convinced them to help him found a hermitage in Mamre Hall for the purpose of chanting in devotion of rubies. They named it the Hermitage of the Radiant. Okay, so this is the story of Osei, obsessed with gems. Okay, so what we do when we generate, every time you start a game of Caves of Qud, we generate a new history. And to constrain the sort of colossal scope of generating a full-blown history, what we've decided to do is center the history around these 5 great sultans who are these leaders from the sort of pre-fall past of the world of Qud. And we have a lot of sort of handwritten lore that we've developed for the game before we added the system. So the idea is that we're the sort of time period where these histories are being generated are from this sultanate, from this era that took place before a lot of the handwritten lore is set. So here's that shrine. So like I said, when we generate a history, it's different every game. If you use a different world seed, you'll get a different history and a different set of 5 sultans. But you never really have like direct insight into the history. There's no like legends mode like there is in Dwarf Fortress where you can just kind of read the history line by line. Instead, it's always filtered through the lens of the present of the game world's present, which means you can only learn about the history through interacting with the world and the cultural artifacts in the world. So those cultural artifacts include things like these shrines that you find around the world that kind of cultures have built up in veneration of these sultans. It's also things like, okay, so this is a mace, right? It's an object in the world. You can pick it up, you can wield it, you can also look at it. So this is an engraved mace. It's engraved with a scene from the life of the ancient Sultan Osei. So let's read this. On the night of the full moon, a babe was found swaddled with emeralds on its eyes by a group of tortoises in Taiwan Palace. They took him into their fold and fostered him, and he became known as Ose, shining scion of tortoises. Okay, this is a glass bottle. It's filled with wine. You could drink from it. It's a liquid container. It also is a cultural artifact. Sometimes they're painted with scenes from these histories. So this one, okay, let's read this. Deep in Taewon Palace, Ose stumbled upon a clan of cats performing a secret ritual. Because of his reputation for murdering someone by trapping him in a jewel, they furiously rebuked him and declared him a villain to their kind. Okay. So as you accrue more and more of these snippets of history about a sultan, they get inscribed in a player journal in chronological order. And as you accrue more and more of them, a sort of narrative starts to cohere around the sultan's life. So we can see like Ose seems to be like obsessed with jewels, right? There's a theme running in his life, like he was born with emeralds on his eyes. He trapped someone in a jewel in order to murder them, and then he's founded a workshop to chant in devotion of rubies. So that's cool. So let's go back. So this glass bottle, right? It mentions a location here, deep in Taewon Palace. So Taewon Palace, whenever a location is mentioned in these histories, it's a location that was generated during the course of the history, and then that we take and we instantiate in the world in some way. And in fact, with the first time you discover one of these cultural artifacts that mentions one of these places, you get this little message. You discover the location of Taewon. You inscribe it in your journal. And you actually get a procedurally generated quest to visit it. So new quest, go visit Taewon. Okay. So this is the world map. Taewon becomes like an actual physically instantiated place in the world. The rich build opulent monuments to themselves in the extinct district whose ruins lie under the chrome carcasses of giants. So these descriptions are also partially procedurally generated based on the properties of the location that were generated as part of history generation. So let's say we travel there, we complete our quest, we get our XP, and this is actually like a dungeon level from the location. And so some of the dungeon builder like is informed by the properties that were generated during history generation. So Taewon Palace was a place where the rich lived. There are still some vestiges of this. There are these little kind of like garden alcoves that were generated as a result of that. There's also this place in the center that's called the Becoming Nook. And what this is, it's a place where the ancient aristocrats would go and install cybernetic implants. And we know that this is kind of a place where the wealthy lived because only this technology was only really accessible to the wealthy. So if there was this Becoming Nook here, it was likely that some wealthy aristocrats lived here. Unfortunately, right now, it's infested with teleporting spiders. But if you're able to clear them out, you could actually approach this place and you can like access the rack in the Becoming Nook, and there's a weird artifact there, and you can examine it, and oh, okay, it's a cybernetic implant. It's motorized tread, so you could actually replace your legs with motorized tread, which was fashionable among aristocrats at the time. Okay, so one last thing about Ose is that why is Ose obsessed with gems, right? Is this a coincidence that they were born with emeralds in their eyes and then had a bunch of other like interesting interactions with gems? So it's not. So one thing we wanted to do to kind of make each of the sultans sort of memorable and blur the lines between history and myth is that we sort of wanted to like assign them a archetypical unit of culture that we call a domain. So a domain could be, it's sort of like a culturally resonant physical object or phenomenon, so things like jewels or ice or starlight. It could also be more abstract concepts like scholarship or might, and they sort of function like epithets do in epic poetry, right, to associate this character with some sort of like resonant cultural meme. And so that's what happened here. Ose became obsessed with jewels. Okay. Uduk the many-spoused. So when we generate history in Caves of Qud, we do it one event at a time. So like an example of the event from the previous slides was, there's the birth event where the Sultan is born and something happens, or there's an example event is like sieges a city. The Sultan might decide to siege a city. If you imagine reading the biography of an ancient king or queen, an event might correspond to like a chapter in that biography. So one of the events that we added fairly recently was a marriage event. So the Sultan gets married. They cement alliances with factions. They have a nice wedding. Unfortunately, when we added this event, there was a bug that caused it to be the only event that occurred. And so the result of that was that we had this really like polyamorous sultanate where all the sultans, all they did was get married. So we could see here, like, inside a colossal block of ice, Uduk cemented her friendship with cats by marrying Shalabor. Waist deep in a lake of frost, Uduk cemented her friendship with electricians by marrying Amraruk. Waist deep in a lake of rime, Uduk cemented her friendship with baboons by marrying Hu-u-u-u-e. That's a baboon. And you might have, like, the fact that Uduk seems to be so interested in, like, she gets, like, her wedding location is a colossal block of ice or a lake of frost or, like, stark naked and freezing temperatures. You may have surmised that, like, her domain is ice. That's like, whereas Ose's was jewels. Yeah, that's all okay. So this is an engraved bronze dagger from Uduk's life. This is like representing her death event. So every sultan ultimately dies, and there's an event sort of recounting that history. So in 507, Uduk, spouse of Otbazi, companion of Terrera Crab, mate to Shalpapur, partner of Amaruk, wife of Hui, wife of Sharu, wife of Azona, 6A6 error, missing hex values, partner, that's a robot. She married a robot. Et cetera, et cetera. Okay. Sixersi loved by dogs. So let's read some events from Sixersi's life. So during an expedition around Garrison Quarter Belep, Sixersi lost control of her chariot and drove it off a cliff. By chance, a group of nearby dogs came to her rescue. For the rest of her life, Sixersi was indebted to dogs. At the Battle of Harchuva Den, Sixersi fought to liberate dogs. She wielded a freezing axe with such prowess that it became forever known as Freezingicus, the boon of dogs. Some of these name generators could use some work. But so just like when we're generating the history and we end up taking the locations that we generated and instantiating them in the real world, we do the same with items. So here's another event. Okay, so really quickly, in 505, Sixersi won a decisive battle against the combined forces of the Hippodrome Quarter of Migaruk at the bloody Battle of Itara, though she lost her prize Freezingicus, the boon of dogs, during the course of the conflict. Okay, so this means that, like I said, like Hippodrome Quarter of Migaruk, it's an actual place that gets instantiated in the world, and because Sixersi lost this artifact there, we can expect to actually travel there and find it. So we read this historical snippet on a shrine. We get a quest, the procedural quest to visit the Hippodromes of Migaruk. We also get a procedural quest to recover Freezingicus, the boon of dogs. So let's remember that for a minute. Let's put it aside. But so what does it mean that? Okay, so like Sixersi was loved by dogs, right? She seemed to be fond of dogs herself. Like, what does that mean in terms of the experience that you might have in the game? Well, dogs are actually one of several factions in Caves of Qud. There are like over 60 factions. Dogs are actually a unique faction. They have the distinction of being the only faction that you start with positive reputation with. Every other faction in the game either like doesn't like you at all or at best feels sort of ambivalently about you, but dogs like you. So what does it mean for that dogs like you, right? Well, dogs favor you. Aggressive ones won't attack you. You're welcome in their holy places. Dogs are interested in trading secrets about locations of humanoid settlements, and sultans they admire or despise. They're also interested in hearing gossip that's about them, naturally. So what does it mean that a dog wants to trade secrets about sultans they admire or despise, right? We know that sultans admire Sixersi. What that means is that if you find her a particularly smart dog, not every dog can speak, but some dogs can. So if you find a particularly smart dog, then you can share this information that you've learned from exploring the world and like reading this history on a shrine. So meet Nalelb. He's a legendary dog. He's loved by dogs. He's disliked by antelopes for slaying one of their leaders. and he's disliked by tortoises for questioning the origins of the moon. He howled at the moon one too many times. When we up kind of, any creature in the game can become a legendary version of itself, and when it does, it gets kind of uplifted and it gets this procedural backstory and relationships with other factions. So if you're able to find a legendary dog like Nalelb, you can go up to him and talk to him. He's growling softly, so that's fine. But there's also this extra option here, which is, you see here, your thirst is mine, my water is yours. This is, so water has a particular significance in Caves of Qud. It's also the currency of the game. I mean, you have to drink it to stay alive. There's like a survival mechanic, but it's also the currency of the world. And it's rare, fresh water. And so the act of sharing fresh water with someone is sort of like this cultural ritual that's sacred. And when you do so, you can get these special dialogue options. So live and drink, friend, and now you can actually share a secret with Nalelb, and gain some reputation with dogs. And this would only work if it's a secret that Nalelb cares about, but we know that since dogs love Circe, that Nalelb's gonna care about secrets about Circe, so you can share one of these and gain some reputation with dogs. Okay, so dogs love Circe, right? We've established that. Some dogs love Circe so much that they've started a cult to worship her. So we're back on the faction screen. We see dogs here, but right above dogs, you see there's the cult of Circe, right? So most of these factions are statically, or like handwritten. They appear every game, dogs, cats. But then some of them are procedurally generated because they spawn up around these sultans from the procedurally generated history. And they often take the name of the sultan, but not always. Sometimes like this Ikazor Sorrow folk. This is another cult that has spawned up around another sultan who at some point during their history got the cognomen or the nickname of the Ikazor Sorrow, and so the cult sort of decided to name themselves after him. So again, if we remember this quest here, we got the quest to recover Frizingicus. We're going to the Hippodromes of Migaruk, which again is a real location in the world. And when we get there, sure enough, there's a dog cultist. There's feral dog and member of the cult of Circe. This place will be populated with dog cultists. They're generally aggressive, so if you can like kill them all, or maybe find some other way to endear yourself to them, which is possible, they might let you pass through the halls of Migaruk and end up actually finding Frizingicus. So this is the actual artifact. It's an axe, a wooden shaft with a leather handhold, topped with a wickedly curved metal blade. It's carved with tiny images of icicles. There's an engraving of dogs being lifted up on chairs. And this is like, it's procedurally generated. It's informed by the parameters, from the history. So when powered, it does +5 cold damage, and it gives you +200 reputation with dogs. Okay, I want to point out one more thing about Circe. And the history generation. So we have these two events in her life, right? She lost control of her chariot, almost drove it off a cliff, but was saved by dogs. And then the very next event in her life, she fought to liberate dogs. So there's a pretty straightforward causation here, right? Saved by dogs, okay, my life has been turned around, I'm going to go and fight for liberation of dogs. This is actually a trick, though, of the history generation. So the way that history is generated, the occurrence of event has does not dictate the next event to follow. So what happened here was Circe was driven off a cliff, or was saved by dogs. Then we chose a totally random event from the bag of event types that we have. That event happened to be Siege a City. That's what this is. But then in order to rationalize the event, to create a cause for it when we're generating a description of it, we look at previous events in Circe's life and ask for essentially query for reasons why she might be sieging a city. And what the system found in this case was that, oh, well, she has a relationship with dogs, and so we want to, we'll say that she was fighting to liberate dogs. So it's kind of like there's no actual inherent cause and effect to the system. We're just picking events randomly and then rationalizing their causes. Okay. So along those same lines, we like to, kind of in the aesthetic principle we have with a lot of our procedural generation is that we like to be very hands-off. We kind of like to let our generators run wild. So we didn't want to prescribe any sort of narrative arc for the lives of the sultans, right? We didn't want to have a sort of hero's journey, or say that you have a formative event in your childhood and then you have like a struggle and you overcome it. We wanted to kind of just let the system go wild and see what happened. And we sort of afforded ourselves this freedom because this whole system is a little tertiary. It's not like along the critical path, so we don't need to have an exciting life for a sultan. If a sultan has like a sort of bizarre, strange life, that's fine. You'll generate another one next game anyway. So we place very few restrictions on the lives of the sultans. One of the few restrictions we place is that at some point during your life as a sultan, you have to become the sultan, right? So this is Issei, is a shrine to Issei. In early 101, Issei assassinated the Sultan of Qud over the rights of crabs. He won and seized the gilded scepter. He was 100 years old. And then the very next event, in 101, Issei, two-born, the terror of Danemore, husband to Senibknekrab, died of natural causes. He was 100 years old. So he waited 100 years in his life, and then he became sultan, and then the following day he died. So a thing about this that I find kind of funny is that, like, it turns out that the sultan he assassinated was actually his father, and there's also this kind of like mini narrative that's cohered here too, right? Because he assassinated his father over the rights of crabs, but then we find out here that he was actually married to a crab. So I have this funny image in my head of like a 100-year-old man arguing with his dad about his crab in-laws. Okay, here's where things get weird. But before we talk about Polydeities, I want to kind of touch on something that was talked about yesterday. So I think Darius talked about the oatmeal problem, right? This idea that you can generate things that are somehow actually structurally distinct but not really interesting to someone reading about them. This is also like, so there's this property of things that you'd like to generate where they're characterful, right? Where they're like different in a meaningful way. So in order to add some characterfulness to our history generation, in addition to just like procedurally varying the sultans that we're generating, we also like to do some higher level like macro variation on the structure of society that we're generating. So a couple instances of this, like sometimes we set the successor rate really high. So the 5 sultans, you can see here in this history, 4 of the 5 sultans are named Polydeities and like are come from this one dynasty. Another way we do this is that we saw from a previous slide, this place, Taiwan Palace. So sometimes the way we organize the locations in the historical past is by wealth. So here there were palaces, there were also slum districts, and there were middle-class districts. Sometimes we change the organizing principle entirely. So sometimes it's by function. So here there's like a garrison quarter. There would also be a museum quarter, or we have like the hippodromes of Migaruk. So yeah, I mean, this is sort of an important part of creating meaningful variation, I think. Okay, so back to Polydeities' life. So one auspicious day, a babe was found swaddled on a floating platform of polished chrome with its mouth full of the fabric of time. That babe came to be known as Polydeities IV. Acting against the prohibition on the practice of stopping time, Polydeities led an army to the gates of Damirmir Spire. She freed its citizens, and they crowned her sultans of Qud. In her honor, they changed the name of Damirmir Spire to Polydeities. Okay, one more. While wandering around Havana Hall, Polydeities stumbled upon a clan of bears performing a secret ritual. Because of her reputation for murdering someone with a dagger made of tiny gears, they accepted her into their fold and taught her secrets. So Polydeities was living her best life, clearly. Here's another clay picture painted with a scene from her life. So at a remote dig site, Polydeities met with a group of geologists and commissioned an artifact that evoked the presence of a periodic moment in time chosen arbitrarily. She named it the Star of Moment. And again, this is a named artifact, so that means it really exists. So we can go and find it. Here it is, the Star of Moment. Tiny glyphs are inscribed on each exterior face of this handheld box. It's embossed with beautiful atomic clocks. And on activation, it obliterates all visible members of a chosen faction from the Sultanate. So she commissioned an artifact that evoked the presence of a periodic moment in time chosen arbitrarily, and that moment was death. Let's see here. Oh, we skipped one. Okay, this is pretty good. So after striking a deal with cannibals, Polydeities convinced them to help her found a workshop in the Takesh barrio for the purpose of assembling contraptions based on forgotten seconds of one's life. That's cool. Here's another artifact that came about as a result of her life. It's called the Orbital Joy Polydeities Boon. It's a helmet, and the descriptions of these are like mixes of. They're sort of hybrids of handwritten descriptions that are parameterized by some of the procedural elements. So like so the name of the old aristocrats from the pre-fall past, we call them eaters. So early eaters had enlarged their skulls for cosmetic reasons. By the time of Polydeities IV, the high minaret dwellers took to wearing them as helms. Okay, this one is exquisitely decorated. It's painted with beautiful forgotten seconds of one life. So when you wear it, it gives you +1 ego, and it also grants you this mutation, temporal fugue, and this is a very powerful mutation in Caves of Qud. What it means is that if you're walking around as like a traveler in the world of Qud, you can multiply yourself and create some clones of yourself that will fight for you, and they have all your abilities and they have all of your equipment as well. Now this is kind of dangerous. Like if you were watching the Caves of Qud playthrough yesterday, you know there's a defect in Caves of Qud called Evil Twin, where occasionally some parallel version of yourself from across space and time tracks you down to destroy you. So you're Evil Twin here, and if you're wielding an artifact that gives you temporal fugue, that means your twin will also have that artifact, and they'll create their own clones, and that means you're in danger of starting an epic battle with all of your time clones. But on the other hand, on the upside, if you were to start an epic battle with all of your time clones, you might be inscribed in the annals of history as the next Sultan of Qud. So thank you. All right. I don't know if we'll be posting the actual slides, but this is a link here that I can link somewhere else. But this is a paper we wrote for the Foundations of Digital Games conference this year that actually describes how we're generating the history. So if you're interested in that, check that out.
Cool. We have time for a few questions.
I think you just anticipated my question. I was very curious about the mechanics of how you do this. Seems like there's like a lot of logic in terms of kind of selecting themes and then perhaps some templated grammar-based text generation or something like that.
Right. So very shortly, it's kind of a combination between a grammar. So if you're familiar, tracery was mentioned a few times yesterday. It's like a tracery-like system to generate these descriptive text snippets of the history. And then there's sort of like an internal state machine that is looking at what we'll do is if a sultan is liked by a faction, liked by dogs, right? That state will kind of hook up to a rule in the grammar that will say, have some things to generate, like reasons for sieging a city would be liberate faction, and that faction is replaced by dogs. Yeah. You could read the paper. It has all the details about
it. For your, I guess you could call it maybe natural language processing of your own languages that you're creating for the names of people, do you find that those in your designs evolve over time, and does the player impact have anything to do with how people become named, or how the language changes?
Well, so there's not, we don't really have much in the way of simulating linguistic drift or anything. We have these, no, I guess I would say that most of that is static. We have our name generation and it's kind of done in a similar way as we do the text generation via the grammar, and then that all happens at world generation, and from there the history is kind of set. Although certain things you can do throughout the game affect other pieces of the text generation, the name generations, but not really the history. Yeah.
Hey. Hello. Hey. So as a semi-casual Qud player, often I find just the sheer diversity of procedurally generated content to be a little bit overwhelming. Mm-hmm. I guess there's two ways to approach the question. As a player, what would you like me to do to be able to better keep track of sort of the hints of these lineages that you're procedurally generating, / what could you imagine building in terms of new UI elements to help me better sort of reinforce this thing must be related to this other thing because there's a dog connection and an ice connection over here and so on.
Okay, let me ask, so a question for you. Have you played since this update where we added the journal, where the history gets inscribed?
No, I actually hadn't seen that until now.
Yeah, okay. So the problem you were describing was like very real and present. So we had this generated history. You could read these cultural artifacts, but we didn't actually have a journal at the time. So you had to like either be taking very diligent notes or just kind of remember them off the cuff. So now we actually like do the inscription in the journal for you, and so you could just reference, there's a Sultan tab in your journal, and you could look at all of the like snippets of history that you found in order, and like you can sort of just, once you actually accrue a bunch of them, you can sort of just read them as a story, and that they're supposed to read that way. So yeah.
Hi. So this is kind of two things. So first, I was wondering to what degree those histories, the generated histories, can intersect or inform each other, since you had sort of like time spans for them. And second, if they do, if there's any system in place to make sure that there aren't some sort of like contradictions, like a sultan gets assassinated by like two different other sultans or something like that.
Yeah, so for a given history, which again happens per game, right? So if I start a history in a game and then I start a new game, it's totally different history. Unless you say, we have like world seeds, so you could use the same world seed. But for a given history, yes, they do influence each other. We kind of generate them along a timeline. So the early sultans might, I think you might have noticed somewhere, like sometimes the Sultan will have a battle and like it'll be so epic that they'll rename the location to a new name, like the Freezing Waste or whatever. And yeah, like later Sultans in their world, the location is called the Freezing Waste, and they can, so it's all happening along a single timeline, and there is sort of like a progression of influence that way. Yeah.
Cool. Thank you so much, Jason.
Yeah. Thank you.